the modern global economy did not become fragile when it began to break down. Crises merely revealed the fragility that was already there. Cheap energy, open sea routes, low tariffs, predictable currencies, political stability, and abundant credit. When all of these function simultaneously for a long period, what emerges is a picture of prosperity. For a time, that picture looked like progress. In reality, however, it was prosperity built on a highly conditional and fragile system. Factories moved to wherever labor was cheapest. Components crossed oceans multiple times before becoming final products. Inventories were minimized. Efficiency was elevated as a virtue. Consumers enjoyed low prices. Governments, meanwhile, implied that this structure was not the result of historical conditions, but the natural endpoint of history. Then the shocks came. A canal was blocked, a war began. A ship ran aground in the Suez Canal. Armed attacks disrupted security in the Red Sea. Critical raw material shortages emerged. Sudden tariff hikes followed. A frantic race began for ships, fuel, and fertilizers. And at that point, the system that appeared elegant under calm conditions revealed what it truly was, a machine with too many exposed vulnerabilities. Recent IMF studies emphasize that if fragmentation accelerates, the adjustment costs of supply chains will rise rapidly, and global GDP losses could become substantial. As of 2026, the UN Conference on Trade and Development notes that global trade is being weighed down by geopolitical fragmentation, slowing growth, and rising national regulations. So what is the underlying reality? The illusion, diversification or concentration. Globalization was sold as diversification. A wider world, more suppliers, more markets, more flexibility. But behind this narrative lay a different truth: the system's greatest gains did not come from diversification, but from optimization. Production concentrated in the lowest cost locations. Trade routes were compressed into the most efficient corridors. Inventories were minimized. Finance was standardized. Energy dependence became normalized. Because the system's map appeared global, people assumed the system itself was broad and secure. They were often wrong. What looked like diversification from the consumer's perspective was, in reality, concentration. Globalization did not eliminate local bottlenecks, it embedded them into a much larger network. IMF research on fragmentation confirms this. When trade is redirected, some connector countries may benefit in the short term, but in the long run, all countries become more fragile. First weak point: route dependency. The global economy likes to describe itself as distributed. But in reality, most of its value still flows through a handful of narrow choke points. Maritime trade is the backbone of globalization, and maritime trade means straight trade. The Panama Canal, the Red Sea, Suez, the Black Sea, and the Strait of Hormuz. UNCTAD's March 2026 bulletin highlights that roughly a quarter of global seaborne oil trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz, making it critical for food security, energy supply, shipping costs, and global trade. The system may appear planetary in scale, but its functioning depends on a few small points remaining open, secure, and politically manageable. If too much value is forced through too few passages, the global network collapses into a narrow corridor. Moreover, route disruptions do not remain confined to logistics. They spread. When ships are rerouted, journeys lengthen, fuel costs rise, insurance prices increase, schedules become unreliable, and working capital remains tied up for longer. Reuters reports that even efforts by Western powers to secure Red Sea trade have struggled, and securing Hormuz in escalation scenarios would be far more difficult. Globalization presented speed as a permanent feature. The straits remind us that it was always rented. Second weak point: concentration disguised as diversification. Many of today's most critical products do not come from broad, redundant ecosystems, but from a few dominant processors, refiners, manufacturers, and production hubs. This is especially evident in industrial raw materials and strategic inputs. OECD data shows that export restrictions on industrial raw materials increased more than five-fold between 2009 and 2023, with over 500 new raw mineral products facing at least one export restriction in 2023 alone. Governments impose this many restrictions only when they recognize the strategic value of concentration. The system appeared global, but bottlenecks were mostly local. One country dominated processing, another refining, another assembly, another transport corridors. consumers saw a global marketplace. The system itself was a handful of pressure points wrapped in international packaging. A single policy decision, embargo, sanctions package, or domestic crisis in one country can send shockwaves across continents. The system was designed to maximize efficiency, not to absorb conflict. Those are very different design goals. Third weak point, the myth of cheap energy. Much of globalization's elegance did not come from software or logistics management, but from something far more basic: fuel cheap enough to make distance nearly irrelevant. Long supply chains only appeared rational because energy was so cheap. Cheap energy suppressed transport costs, stabilized consumer prices, and made just-in-time systems look brilliant. But that brilliance was conditional. When energy prices surged, the model began to lose one of its central supports. UNCTAD's latest warnings make this clear: instability in energy choke points rapidly transmits shocks into supply chains, commodity markets, and broader development outcomes. A significant portion of globalization's efficiency was simply energy abundance in a suit. Fourth weak point, the elimination of buffers. Modern supply chains learned to hate excess. Inventories were cut. Warehousing shrank. Supplier lists were tightened. Managers were rewarded for reducing waste. Over time, waste came to include the buffers that keep systems functioning under stress. This was the age of just-in-time logistics. And it worked perfectly, until the world refused to arrive just in time. UNCTAD's maritime assessments show that route disruptions increase delays, reduce reliability, and raise operational costs. A system optimized for precision behaves exactly like this when confronted with a world governed by weather, war, sanctions, labor disputes, and political retaliation. Redundancy looks inefficient in calm times. In crises, it starts to look like civilization itself. Fifth weak point, financial fragility. Globalization is not only about the movement of goods, it is about the movement of credit. Cargo is financed. Inventory is financed. Imports are hedged. Payments are cleared. Insurance stands behind shipments. Banks intermediate trade risk. And dollar liquidity often sits at the center of it all. This means trade fragility is never purely physical. When routes become unreliable or costs surge, the damage spills into margins, working capital, financing conditions, and inflation. IMF research on fragmentation shows that while trade redirection can create short-term opportunities, it can also make connector economies more fragile, as unpredictable trade patterns complicate financial management. Globalization runs on containers. But it also runs on credit. And neither was as solid as the glossy presentations suggested. Sixth weak point, politics was always there. Post-Cold War globalization was built on an unusual assumption: geopolitics would calm down, great power competition would remain limited, tariffs would continue falling, and states would increasingly prioritize efficiency over control. That assumption is collapsing. Tariffs are back. Industrial policy is back. Export controls are back. Strategic restructuring is back. The OECD directly links rising export restrictions to geopolitical tensions and strategic competition. The world built a system on the assumption that politics would become less disruptive over time. History had other plans. In this context, recent resilience data must be read carefully. The World Bank notes that global trade showed surprising resilience in 2025, partly supported by inventory accumulation. But inventory accumulation often represents stress pulled forward, precautionary stockpiling, and firms paying extra to avoid future disruptions. The system is still functioning. But it operates with more insurance, more redundancy, more policy distortion, and more tied-up working capital. Resilience is real. So is the cost of needing it. The core rule: connection is not security. When globalization depends simultaneously on concentrated nodes, cheap energy, easy finance, route stability, thin inventory buffers, and political calm, it becomes economically fragile. This is not a random list, it is the model itself. The weak points are not external flaws attacking a perfect machine, they are structural features built into the machine. Globalization's greatest weakness was not that it connected the world, but that it convinced the world that connection and security were the same thing. Connection lowers costs. It accelerates growth. But it also transmits shocks faster, spreads dependency more widely, and turns local disruptions into global consequences with surprising speed. IMF studies, OECD data, and UNCTAD's maritime warnings all point in the same direction. The system's greatest strengths came bundled with deep structural risks. The final lesson is not that globalization was a mistake. That would be an oversimplification, and oversimplifications are often the graveyard of serious analysis. Globalization created unprecedented abundance, growth, and efficiency. But it also built a world where convenience rests on dependency, and where economic peace was quietly subsidized by cheap energy, open routes, cheap credit, and restrained geopolitics. Those conditions can no longer be safely assumed. The system is not disappearing. But its true cost is becoming visible. The weak points of globalization are where convenience turns into dependency, and where the dream of a frictionless world collides with the reality that trade still runs on straits, raw materials, fuel, finance, and power. History did not suddenly return. It was always there, waiting for the machine to lose its balance.